Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we, take a deep dive into the fascinating stuff you send us.
And today we're diving into,
A figure that's, I gotta say, pretty larger than life.
yeah, Eva Peron.
Evita.
Exactly.
You sent us a really interesting mix of sources about her, including this historical podcast.
Oh, yeah, the rest is history.
Yes, and, it's clear from the get-go that we're dealing with somebody who, she's not just a historical figure.
No,
It's almost like she's become a myth.
a legend.
And what's striking is how quickly that happened.
Right. I mean, even while she was still alive.
Yeah, like think about that poem that the rest is history quoted.
Yeah, the one dedicated to Eva.
It's almost religious, the language.
It is. Comparing her to the Virgin Mary, talking about her being transfigured into hope.
Right, transfigured into hope. I mean, wow.
It really gives you a sense of the almost religious fervor
The devotion.
that surrounded her.
And it wasn't just that poem. The nicknames she was given, the Lady of Hope, the Bridge of Love.
Mm-hmm.
These weren't just like casual names.
No, they were very deliberately crafted.
Yeah, to shape public perception, to present her as this.
This almost divine figure, a link between the people and Peron's government.
But it's like how much of this was genuine and how much was.
Calculated political strategy?
That's the question, right?
It's so hard to tell, especially because she was so good at using her personal story.
To connect with people.
Yeah, I mean, she didn't come from privilege.
No, not at all.
Eva's early life was marked by poverty, by hardship.
And she used that.
She drew on those experiences constantly in her speeches, her public appearances.
And that's what I think is so interesting about her work with the Eva Peron Foundation. It wasn't just some abstract concept to her,
No, she lived those struggles.
When she talked about social justice, when she championed the working class, it resonated with people.
It had a real authenticity to it coming from her.
Exactly. But, of course, we have to consider the other side of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
The foundation, as much as it did good, it was also a tool, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It solidified Juan Perón's power, built this cult of personality around both of them.
It's tricky, right? You have this woman who seems to genuinely care about the poor, who's working tirelessly to improve their lives.
And yet she's part of this political system that's using her image.
To further its own ends.
It's complicated, and to really understand it, you have to understand Peronism itself.
Because it wasn't just a political party.
No, it was this whole movement with all these different factions.
The unions, the women's movement, the military, all with their own agendas.
And their own views on Eva's role.
Okay, so we've got this internal power struggle going on within Peronism, and then early 1950, Eva collapses.
And later, it comes out that she'd been diagnosed with cancer.
But at the time, it was all very hush-hush.
Very secret.
And this is where things get really interesting, because her illness, it becomes intertwined with all this political tension.
It throws everything into disarray.
Yeah, and then comes this idea, Eva running for vice president in the 1951 election.
Can you imagine? A woman in 1950s Argentina aspiring to be second in command.
And not just any woman.
No, a woman who had come from such humble beginnings.
It was a radical idea.
It really was.
And it sent shockwaves through the establishment.
The reactions were all over the map.
The unions, they loved it.
They saw her as their champion.
For the military. Not so much.
Not at all. They were very wary of her.
And then there's Juan Perón himself.
Just in the middle.
Trying to balance all these competing interests.
And then there's that massive rally, the Cabildo Abierto.
Organized by the unions.
2 million people, they say, descended on Buenos Aires.
It's hard to even imagine the logistics of that.
It was a show of force, a way to demonstrate the massive popular support for Eva.
And maybe to force Perón's hand.
It's like a scene from ancient Rome, the emperor weighing the desires of the people.
And in the midst of all this, Eva gives that famous speech.
So emotional, she's in tears.
And her refusal of the vice presidency, it's ambiguous.
Some people saw it as genuine reluctance.
Others as a calculated move to increase public desire.
To make them want her even more.
It's like she's caught between her own ambitions, her declining health.
And this incredible pressure from the public.
What must have been going through her mind at that moment?
It's hard to even fathom.
And we have to remember that all of this is happening against the backdrop of some very real challenges.
Argentina's economy is starting to struggle.
There's growing unrest.
Perón's grip on power, while still strong, is not absolute.
It's a powder keg waiting to explode.
And Eva's health is deteriorating.
You can see it in her appearance. It's impacting her ability to work.
But she keeps pushing herself.
Rallies, speeches, even as her body is failing her.
And her rhetoric starts to change.
It takes on a harder edge.
The Lady of Hope is now talking about defending the people with her claws and teeth.
This is a stark
It's
contrast.
like she's becoming more desperate, more confrontational.
There's a quote from The Rest is History that I found really chilling.
Oh.
She elected to die for Perón and Peronism.
Wow.
It's this idea of self-sacrifice.
It's both admirable and unsettling.
And you see that in her final public appearances, like that last Loyalty Day rally.
Where she's clearly in pain.
Reliant on morphine just to get through it.
And Perón gives this speech that sounds like a eulogy.
She collapses into his arms,
It's also staged so dramatic.
designed to evoke strong emotions.
To cement her image as a martyr.
And then there's that story about Eva ordering guns and pistols for the trade unions.
Without Perón's knowledge.
It adds this whole other layer to her rhetoric.
A more militant, almost violent side.
Like behind all the devotion, there might have been
A darker side to her thinking.
a willingness to use force.
It's a tragic turn.
This woman who had captivated a nation built this image of hope and strength,
Now facing her own mortality.
determined to go out on her own terms.
Fighting to the very end.
And that brings us to July of 1952.
The end of Eva Perón's extraordinary life.
But even in death, her story is far from over.
Oh no, not at all.
Join us for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll explore the truly bizarre events surrounding Eva Perón's embalmed body.
And the enduring legacy of a woman who, in death, became even more mythologized than in life.
It's a wild ride, folks. You won't want to miss it. So last time we left off with Eva Perón's death in 52, but her story, it doesn't end there.
Not even close. In fact, you could say things get even more interesting after she's gone.
More interesting how?
Well, for starters, there's this whole thing with her body. It doesn't just get a simple burial.
You mentioned this Dr. Ara, a specialist in embalming. What's his role in all this?
Right, so Dr. Pedro Ara, he comes in shortly after Eva dies, and his task, well, it's pretty unique.
Evita.
He's supposed to prepare her body for public display.
Public display, like an open casket.
Something like that, but remember, they're building this image of Eva as almost saintly.
Right, the Lady of Hope.
Exactly, so they want to preserve her body, make it look like, well,
Like she's untouched by death.
yeah, completely and definitively incorruptible were the words they used.
Incorruptible. Wow. That's a bit much, isn't it?
It is, but it speaks to the whole mindset of the Peronist regime at the time.
So it's not just preserving the body, it's preserving the myth.
The image, the legend of Evita.
And this created some logistical problems, right?
Oh, huge problems. Dr. Ara needed time to work, a controlled environment.
But the public.
The public wanted to see their Evita, they were grieving, and they wanted to say goodbye.
So they let them view the body before the embalming was finished.
Yeah, they did, and it was chaos. Millions of people over 14 days, all filing past Eva's body.
14 days.
14 days, can you imagine? And Dr. R's trying to do his work in the middle of all this?
That must have been pretty difficult for him.
To say the least, I mean, the crowds were so intense. People were getting injured.
Injured?
Yeah, crushed in the crowds. They even had to drill holes in the coffin.
To let the condensation out.
Exactly. It was wild. And all of this is happening while Argentina is practically shut down.
Shut down.
Public transport, businesses, everything. And every morning, a mandatory 15-minute silence.
What?
While they played excerpts from Eva's autobiography over loudspeakers.
It sounds almost dystopian, this mix of mourning and propaganda.
It was a strange time, and this focus on Eva's body, it just added to the whole spectacle.
So, did Dr. Ara ever get to finish the embalming?
He did. Eventually, after the public viewing, they moved the body to the CGT headquarters.
The trade union.
Yeah, and Dr. R set up his lab there to finish the preservation process.
So finally, a bit of peace and quiet, right?
You'd think so, but no, while he's working, the political situation in Argentina takes a sharp turn.
Oh no, what happened?
Remember those tensions within Peronism we talked about?
Yeah, the unions, the military.
Well, it all comes to a head in 1955, a military coup.
The coup.
They overthrow Perón, he flees the country, and Argentina's thrown into turmoil.
So Perón's gone, the military's in charge. What happens to Eva's body?
Well, the new government sees it as a threat, a symbol of the regime they just overthrew.
Resemble.
They decide to erase her, to make her disappear.
But how do you erase someone who's already achieved such iconic status, even in death?
They decided to hide her body.
Hide it where?
It was a secret operation. They took the body to Italy and buried it under a false name.
So Eva Perón ends up in an unmarked grave in a foreign country. That's kind of anticlimactic, isn't it?
It's definitely a strange twist, and it gets weirder because remember, they embalmed her to last.
Incorruptible, right?
So she's in this state of suspended animation, buried in Italy, while Argentina's going through this upheaval.
And that's not the end of it, is it?
Oh no, not by a long shot. The story takes another turn in 1971 when this right-wing Perenist comes onto the scene.
Right-wing Pernus.
Yeah, they called him the Warlock. He was a shadowy figure, rumored to lead a death squad.
A warlock leading a death squad.
Sounds crazy, right?
Well,
But he becomes obsessed with finding Eva's body and bringing it back to Argentina.
why? What was his motivation?
Hard to say for sure. Maybe he thought it would gain him favor within the Peronist movement.
Or maybe he was into the occult, thought her body had some kind of power.
Who knows? But he actually manages to exhume the body and smuggle it back to Argentina.
He stole her body.
Essentially. And instead of turning it over to the authorities or the Peronists, he keeps it in his house.
He kept Eva Perón's body in his house.
Yeah, supposedly he built a shrine for it, even dressed the body up, combed her hair.
He was dressing up a dead body. That's creepy.
It is, but it speaks to the power of Eva's image even all these years later.
So we've gone from public adoration to a secret burial to a body-snatching warlock. This is insane.
It is a wild story, but thankfully it doesn't end there.
What happens next?
Well, in 1974, Juan Perón returns to Argentina, becomes president again.
He comes back,
He does, and he demands the return of Eva's body.
and they give it to him.
They do, and it's finally placed in the Duarte family tomb in Buenos Aires.
So after all that, she finally gets a proper resting place.
You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Back in her homeland, at peace.
But
But there are rumors, persistent rumors, that the body in the tomb isn't actually Eva's.
a fake Eva.
Some say her real body was too damaged from all those years in hiding.
So they replaced it with a wax replica.
Maybe. Others claim the real body is hidden somewhere, waiting to be revealed.
That's like something out of a conspiracy theory.
It is, and it's just another layer of mystery surrounding Eva Perón.
So what's the truth?
We may never know for sure, but that's part of what makes her story so fascinating.
We've covered her rise to power, her death, the bizarre journey of her body. But what about her legacy? What did she actually accomplish?
That's what we'll be exploring in part 3 of this deep dive, the myths and realities of Eva Perón's legacy.
Join us next time as we try to untangle the truth about Evita, the woman who continues to fascinate and divide even decades after her death. Okay, so we've gone through a lot with Eva Perón, her life, her death, and then
Some.
yeah, the whole thing with her body.
It's a wild story.
And it kind of leaves you wondering, who was she really?
Right, because you have people who see her as a saint, a champion of the poor.
And others who call her a power-hungry manipulator.
It's fascinating how both sides can have their own version of the truth.
So how do we make sense of it all? How do we separate the myth from the reality?
It's tough because she was so good at cultivating her image,
Lady of Hope?
but at the same time, she genuinely seemed to care about Argentina's working class.
Her work with the foundation, it did a lot of good.
It did, even if it was also a tool for Perón's political ambitions.
It's like you can't deny the positive impact she had.
No, but you also can't ignore the political context, the way she was used to consolidate power.
So it's complicated, a real mix of good intentions and political calculation.
Exactly, and it's hard to know for sure where one ends and the other begins.
I keep coming back to this idea that she was both a product of her time and someone who broke the mold.
Absolutely. I mean, she was operating in a very patriarchal society.
And yet she managed to achieve this incredible level of influence.
She understood the limitations placed on her as a woman, but she found ways to navigate them.
And even her critics, the people who hated Peronism, they admitted she had this charisma,
Oh, yeah, undeniable charisma.
this ability to connect with people on a really deep level.
She was a master of communication, of knowing how to appeal to people's emotions.
Okay, so we talked about the propaganda, the politics, the embalmed body, but what about the practical side of things? Did her social programs actually work?
That's a big question, and there's no easy answer. But on a basic level, they did provide real help to a lot of people.
The hospitals, the schools, the housing,
All of that made a tangible difference in people's lives, especially the poor.
but were they sustainable? Could they have lasted without Eva's force of personality driving them?
That's where it gets debatable. Some argue that they were too reliant on personality and patronage.
Rather than sound economic policy.
Right, and that without structural reforms, they were bound to collapse eventually.
So a mixed bag, short-term benefits, but maybe not the long-term change she envisioned.
And all of that gets tied up with her image, this larger-than-life persona that still looms large in Argentina.
It's like her legacy is this mix of social welfare, political maneuvering, personal charisma.
And myth-making, she's a figure who continues to defy simple categorization.
Makes you wonder what would have happened if she'd lived longer.
Would she have become president? Would Peronism have evolved differently?
It's impossible to know, but it's fascinating to think about.
It is, and it's a reminder that history is rarely neat and tidy. It's messy, complicated, and often unpredictable.
Just like Eva Peron herself.
Exactly.
But we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and I hope it's given you a better understanding of this extraordinary woman.
She was a complex figure, full of contradictions, but undeniably fascinating.
And if you're interested in learning more, I definitely encourage you to check out the sources you sent us.
There's so much more to discover about Eva Peron, her life, her legacy, and the impact she had on Argentina.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another exploration of the stories that shape our world.